Hello everyone. Today we are going to the United States. We are heading back to the spring of 1875, to a city that thought of itself as one of the most civilized places in America. A city of churches and universities and Sunday schools. A city where a respectable family could raise a child in the genuine belief that the world around them was orderly and safe. We are going to Boston. And we are going to a church, a large, prosperous, well-attended Baptist church in the South End, where on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, a 5-year-old girl was taken up into the bell tower, and where the man who took her was the one person every family in that congregation believed they could trust. Boston in 1875 was a city that took its respectability seriously. It was one of the great centers of education in the country. Harvard sat just across the river, the public schools drilled their pupils in reading and writing and scripture, and the rhythm of life for a great many families turned on the church. Sunday was the fixed point of the week. Sunday school was where children were sent to learn their letters and their Bible verses and their moral lessons, and it was, for most parents, the safest few hours of the entire week. You left your child at the church. The church gave them back. In one of the city's most fashionable quarters, on a residential square known as Chester Park, lived the Hobbs family. The head of the household was James W. Hobbs, a retired importer who had spent a long working life building exactly the kind of comfortable, well-regarded position that Chester Park represented. Living with him were his daughter and his granddaughter, a little girl named Mabel Young. Mabel was 5. She had been born in Boston in 1869, the only child of a man named Charles Young, who had died while Mabel was still very small. After his death, Mabel and her mother had come to live under her grandfather's roof, in the comfort and security of one of the best addresses in the city. She was, in every account that survives, an ordinary, cherished, much-loved small child in a family that had every reason to believe the world would be gentle with her. Most Sundays, Mabel was taken to Sunday school by her aunt, Augusta Hobbs, at the Warren Avenue Baptist Church, a large and well-established congregation in Boston's South End. The routine never varied. Miss Hobbs would deliver Mabel to her infant class, and then she would step out to run an errand or stay to talk with the other members of the congregation, and at 3:30, when the classes let out, she would come back to collect her niece and walk her home. On the afternoon of the 23rd of May, 1875, Augusta Hobbs came back to the church at 3:30, exactly as she always did. She spoke for a moment with the Reverend, and then she turned to collect Mabel, and Mabel was not there. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now. Tell us where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. We always want to know, and we love seeing how far this community reaches. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe, hit like, stay with us. Because this is one of the most disturbing cases the city of Boston ever produced, and it turns on a single, chilling fact. The man responsible was the man the whole congregation trusted with the building, with the doors, and with the keys. We are going to a church on an ordinary Sunday. We are going to a search that started as a small worry and became something no one in that building was prepared for. We are going to a locked door at the foot of the bell tower, a man who suddenly could not find the key to a church he was paid to keep, and a teacher who lost patience and opened that door himself with a pair of pliers. And we are going to find out why the police chief of the entire city of Boston already knew the name of the man he was looking for before he had even arrived at the scene. A sexton. A cricket bat carried quietly up a tower, a flock of pigeons, and a 5-year-old girl who went up to the belfry of the Warren Avenue Baptist Church on a Sunday afternoon and never came down on her own. This is the case of Mabel Young, and the man Boston would come to call the Belfry Murderer. When Augusta Hobbs could not immediately find her niece, she did what any of us would do. She assumed the simplest explanation, that Mabel had wandered off to play with another child, that she was somewhere in the building, that she would turn up in a moment looking pleased with herself. She called Mabel's name. She looked through the rooms near the infant class. A few of the other women still at the church joined her. But the minutes passed. And there was no answer, and no small girl appeared. And the worry began to change its shape, from the ordinary impatience of an adult looking for a child into something colder. More people joined the search. They moved through the church calling her name, and still there was nothing. It was around 4 o'clock when the search changed direction entirely. A Sunday school teacher named Walter Sawyer took charge of it, and Sawyer had heard something. People who had been outside the church reported that they had heard a child scream. The screams, they said, had come from high up, from the belfry, the bell tower above the church. They had lasted only a few seconds, and then they had stopped. Sawyer went up toward the gallery door, the door that led to the stairs up into the tower. He did not go alone. He went with the one man whose entire job was the building itself, the church sexton, a 26-year-old named Thomas Piper. At the door the two men stopped. It was locked, and from the other side of it, from up the dark flight of stairs, both men could hear it, faint, weak, unmistakable. The sound of a child moaning. Sawyer turned to the sexton and asked for the key. And here the case turns for the first time. Because Thomas Piper, the man employed to keep this church, the man entrusted with its every lock and door, looked uneasy and said that he did not know where the key was. He had not been up in the belfry since the previous autumn, he said. He was not sure where the key was kept, but he would go and look for it. He disappeared. The moaning continued behind the locked door. Sawyer waited, and when Piper came back, he came back empty-handed. He had not been able to find the key, he said. Walter Sawyer had run out of patience. There was a child making that sound on the other side of a locked door, and the man with the keys could not produce one, so Sawyer reached into his own pocket and took out a pair of pliers. He worked at the lock. After a few moments it gave, and the door came open, and Sawyer pushed through into the narrow stairway and began to climb toward the top of the tower. At the first landing, Sawyer found blood, a fresh pool of it on the floor, and nearby, pushed under a loose floorboard as though someone had wanted it out of sight, there was an object, a cricket bat, smeared with whitewash and with blood. He kept climbing. At the top of the stairs there was a heavy trap-door. Sawyer pushed it open, and as he did, the whole belfry seemed to erupt around him, because dozens of pigeons that roosted in the tower took off all at once, startled into the air by the intrusion, wings everywhere in the dim light. And when they had cleared, Sawyer saw her. Mabel Young was lying on the floor of the belfry. Her head was covered in blood. Her skull had been crushed, but she was alive. Sawyer bent down and lifted her as carefully as he could, and he carried her down out of the tower, down the narrow stairs, back into the body of the church, and laid her in the nave. Augusta Hobbs and the other parishioners rushed to her. Word had already gone out for the police and a doctor, and they arrived quickly. But anyone who looked at the child could see how grave it was. Mabel was unconscious. She did not wake. The doctors did what little could be done, and the question that hung over the whole church that evening was whether she would survive the night at all. She held on far longer than anyone expected. Mabel Young never regained consciousness, but she did not die that night or the next morning. She lived until 8 o'clock the following evening, the 24th of May, before she finally slipped away. A 5-year-old child fighting for a full day and more, for a life that had been decided in a few seconds in a bell tower. And from almost the first moment, the police investigation kept returning to the same man, the sexton. Thomas Piper had behaved strangely from the start. The missing key, the unease, the claim that he had not been up in the belfry fizz, or half a year. Witnesses began telling the officers that they had seen Piper lingering about the church at odd hours, falling into unsettling conversations. And when the police questioned him directly, Piper said it plainly and confidently. He had not set foot in that belfry in 6 months. To understand why the police found that claim so interesting, you have to understand who Thomas Piper actually was, because the quiet, agreeable young churchman the parishioners thought they knew was a careful construction, and underneath it was something else entirely. Piper had been born in Nova Scotia in 1849 and had come to Boston with his family as a teenager. He was clever and well-spoken. He had worked as a carpenter and then as a clerk, and he was a genuinely devout member of the Baptist community, which is precisely how he came to the Warren Avenue Baptist Church. His own brother was a member there, studying for the ministry, and it was on that brother's recommendation that Thomas was given the position of sexton. He was the keeper of the church. He held its keys. He greeted the congregation in the vestibule on Sunday mornings. The families trusted him completely, and he was recognizable all over the neighborhood by the long black cape he liked to wear. But Piper had a private life that none of them could see. He suffered from a kidney complaint, and he treated it himself with a mixture of laudanum, that is opium dissolved in alcohol, and whiskey. The combination gave him hallucinations. He kept a bottle of it hidden among the pews of his own church. The Reverend had once caught him in the vestry, reading a lurid adventure novel called Cord and Crease, a small thing, except that it cracked the surface of the respectable young man the congregation believed in. And there had been a stranger warning still. The 16-year-old daughter of a minister had met Piper alone in the church one evening. Whatever he said to her, she went straight home to her parents and told them she thought he was a very bad man indeed, and that she was afraid of him. And there was the thing the police already knew, the thing that made Chief Edward Savage's mind turn the instant. He heard a child had been attacked in that particular church. A year and a half earlier, on the night of the 5th of December 1873, a young domestic servant named Bridget Landregan had been struck down and killed in the Dorchester area of Boston, beaten about the head with a heavy object by a man who was seen climbing over a fence near the railroad tracks. No one had been convicted. But among the men questioned and released for lack of evidence had been the sexton of the Warren Avenue Baptist Church. Chief Savage lived near that church. He knew its sexton, and the moment he heard the word Belfry, he knew exactly whose name he expected to hear. As the officers worked through the congregation, the picture grew worse. Mrs. Norris, the wife of one of the church deacons, told them Piper often seemed troubled, as if something were weighing on him. And then came the detail that turned suspicion into something close to certainty, because a local shopkeeper told the police that just days before the murder, Thomas Piper had come into his store and sold him 6 pigeons. When the shopkeeper asked where the birds had come from, Piper had answered, easily and without thinking, that he had raised them himself, up in the church belfry. The belfry he had just sworn to the police he had not entered in 6 months. Once the police had caught Piper in that contradiction, everything else began to gather around him. The cricket bat became the center of the case. A deacon named George Norris, who lived at 360 Main Street in Charlestown, told the police that he had seen that very bat earlier on the morning of the murder, sitting in the church library between 10 and 11 o'clock. It had struck him as such an odd thing to find there that he had actually asked one of the Sunday school students who it belonged to and why it was there. The bat had no business in the library, and somehow, in the hours that followed, it had traveled from the library all the way up to the belfry, to the exact place where Mabel Young was attacked. There was more. When the officers had first questioned Piper, they had noticed bloodstains on his collar and on his handkerchief, and when Detective Dearborn searched his room, he found the container of whiskey and laudanum, the mixture Piper used by his own calm explanation to help himself sleep at night. Piper admitted that he had spoken to Mabel that Sunday afternoon, but he insisted it had been nothing, that he had simply asked the little girl whether she liked Sunday school. The investigators, with everything else they were now learning, did not find his explanation reassuring. Then they worked out the timeline of the building itself. Mabel's infant class had been let out earlier than the older children's class, which met in a room directly across the way. After the infants were dismissed, several witnesses had seen Piper at the door of that older classroom, and one man who approached him said Piper had seemed startled and had asked him an oddly pointless question about whether the seats were satisfactory. It was a strange thing to ask. He had no reason to be concerned with that room or its seating, and for several minutes after that encounter, no one could account for where Piper was at all. Those few unaccounted minutes were, the police believed, the window in which Thomas Piper led 5-year-old Mabel Young up the stairs and into the tower. He was arrested and placed in a cell in the basement of City Hall, and it was while he sat in that cell that same evening that the officers brought him the news that Mabel Young had died. His composure broke. The calm, agreeable man retreated into the corner of his cell, and from that point on he answered everything with short, evasive, unhelpful replies, a complete reversal of the cooperative manner he had shown until the moment the child's death became real. Chief Savage was now satisfied that the case was strong. The blood, the contradictions, the testimony stacking up witness by witness, and he ordered the inquest to begin without delay. At that inquest, the picture sharpened further. It came out that when Piper was arrested, he had been carrying 2 sets of keys that between them opened 14 separate doors of the church, including the door to the belfry he claimed he could not access. A boy outside the church described seeing a man leap from the tower and run. And then came the testimony that was hardest of all to hear. A young girl named Florence Lyland told the inquest that she had once complained to her parents that Piper had invited her up to the belfry to see the pigeons, and the daughter of the Reverend William Reyes said that she had told her mother more than once that she thought Mr. Piper was a bad man, and that she was frightened of him. Other parents, it emerged, had heard similar things from their own daughters. On Tuesday, the 8th of June, 1875, the inquest delivered its verdict. 5-year-old Mabel Young had been murdered, and the man who had murdered her was Thomas Piper. He was held to await trial. The trial of Thomas Piper opened on the 11th of December, 1875, and it was a sensation. The newspapers filled their columns with it. It fed 2 appetites in the public at once, a genuine and frightened concern about the safety of children and a darker fascination with the details of the crime itself. Through all of it, Piper sat calm. He showed no nervousness whatsoever. His composure in that courtroom was one of the things people remembered most about him. On the 3rd day, the prosecution brought forward around a dozen young girls, every one of them ready to testify that Piper had at some point invited them up into the belfry. But the defense objected, and the judge ruled their testimony inadmissible. Much of what remained was circumstantial, but it was heavy. A doctor named Joshua Treadwell took the stand and testified that he had found a single light-colored hair on Piper's coat, and that he had compared it against 50 hairs taken from Mabel Young's own head, and concluded that the hair on the coat had been hers. He had also found bloodstains in several places on Piper's clothing. Then 2 men, William Barry and Frederick Glover, testified that between 3:30 and 4 o'clock on the day of the murder, they had seen a man they later identified as Thomas Piper leap from a window of the belfry and run toward the back of the church. Glover added a detail, that the man wore no hat and stumbled as he ran. It was damning, but its force was blunted under cross-examination when Glover was made to admit that he himself had a criminal record, including a prison term for forgery. The defense seized on exactly that. Piper's lawyer, Mr. Avery, turned the prosecution's own witness into a suspect. He argued that Frederick Glover should himself be charged with the murder, pointing to Glover's strange conduct on the day, his disposal of the clothing he had been wearing, and the fact that he had torn the pockets clean out of his coat, which Avery suggested could have been done to hide hands that were stained with blood. And then Avery made his central argument, that there were only 3 unaccounted minutes in Piper's movements that day, that 3 minutes was not time enough to plan and carry out the murder of a child, and that it was far more reasonable to believe Mabel had been struck by some falling object than that this quiet churchman had coldly planned her death days in advance for no motive anyone could name. The jury went out, and they stayed out for 20 hours. When they came back, they told the judge they could not agree. 9 of them had voted to convict. 3 had voted to acquit. It was a hung jury. Piper could be called neither innocent nor guilty, and the whole thing would have to be done again. The second trial began on the 31st of January, 1876. The same witnesses returned, but this time some evidence that had been excluded before was allowed in, and this time Piper was given the chance to address the jury himself. He spoke gently, humbly, courteously, calm and respectful, insisting on his innocence. asking the jury to weigh the evidence carefully, presenting himself not with any outburst of emotion, but with a quiet, composed conviction. It was, by every account, a convincing performance. It did not work. On Tuesday, the 8th of February 1876, Thomas Piper was found guilty of the murder of 5-year-old Mabel Young, and the judge sentenced him to death. The defense appealed. The appeal was denied. With the appeal exhausted, Piper first tried a story. It was a strange and frankly unbelievable one. He claimed he had invited Mabel up to the belfry to see the pigeons after all, and that, wanting to let some fresh air into the tower, he had propped a window open with the cricket bat. He had stepped away for just a moment, he said, and when he came back, the propped-open trapdoor had fallen and struck Mabel on the head. Frightened of being blamed for the accident, he had left her there and said nothing. Almost no one believed a word of it. And then, about 2 weeks before he was due to be executed, Thomas Piper stopped performing. He confessed. He admitted that he had murdered Mabel Young, and then he kept going. He admitted that he had killed Bridget Landregan on the night of the 5th of December 1873, the Dorchester murder he had been questioned over and released for years before. He admitted that he had attacked a woman named Mary Tyner in 1874, that he had been drinking with her, had fallen asleep at her home, had woken in the dead of night, seized a hammer-like object for reasons he could not explain, and struck her again and again before climbing out through a window and going back to the church to sleep. Mary Tyner had survived the attack, but she had never been able to name the man who did it, and her injuries were such that she had been sent to spend the rest of her life in an asylum. And he admitted to one more, an assault on a young woman named Minnie Sullivan, back in December 1871, struck down with a blunt object, and saved only because her screaming frightened him into running. She had survived, injured and badly shaken, and no one had ever been charged. 3 confessed attacks beyond the one he was about to die for, stretching back nearly 5 years, and not enough evidence on any of them to have ever brought a separate charge. In the end, the Ellen only ever convicted Thomas Piper of the single crime it could prove beyond doubt, the murder of 5-year-old Mabel Young in the belfry of the church he had been trusted to keep. On the 26th of May, 1876, Thomas Piper was hanged at the Suffolk County Jail alongside another condemned man. Around 300 people were there to see it done. He made one last request. He asked that his full written confessions, the complete documents, with all their explicit detail, be kept private and never given to the press. Sheriff John Clark considered it and agreed. His reasoning was simple. Most of what Piper had done was already known, and publishing the rest in full would do nothing but pour fresh horror onto a community that had already been through enough, and hand Thomas Piper a larger and darker legacy than he deserved. By keeping the confessions back, Clark spared the public the worst of the detail and left the families of the victims what little dignity remained to them. Thomas Piper was buried privately at Mount Hope Cemetery in a grave that was never marked. The Warren Avenue Baptist Church stood for another few decades. Its congregation merged with another in 1920, and in 1969, the building where Mabel Young died was torn down. In its place, the city put a small park. Mabel Hood. Young was 5 years old. She was taken to Sunday school on an ordinary afternoon by an aunt who loved her, left in a class she went to every week, in a church her family trusted completely. And the one man that entire congregation believed they could trust was the one who carried a cricket bat quietly up into the tower and waited for her there. There is no marker on his grave. There is a small park where the church used to stand, and there is the sound 2 men heard through a locked door on the afternoon of the 23rd of May, 1875, and could not get to in time. Hello everyone, and thank you for spending time with this case. A trusted man, a locked door, and a child a whole city failed to protect. If this case found you, please leave a comment and a like. I will see you in the next case.